there will be unicorns of the ocean, very successful companies, which we call narwhals. This is not for the faint of heart, but it will eventually be as successful as clean tech has been. It does cover 70% of the planet, and you will be able to do everything you do on land in the ocean.
Welcome to Tough Tech Today with Mayan and Miller. This is the premier show featuring trailblazers who are building technologies today to solve tomorrow's toughest challenges.
Welcome to Tough Tech Today. This is the third episode in our series on maritime or blue technologies. My colleague, co-host Forrest, could not join us today, but I am joined by Adam de Sala Pool. Welcome, Adam. Adam is a special advisor for WHOI, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, one of the top institutes globally for these kind of maritime technologies and exploration and research. So Adam specifically is WHOI's special advisor for innovation and entrepreneurship. And this is just one part of a broad career that he's had as an angel investor, as a mentor, and former entrepreneur. Welcome, Adam, to tell us, is all ocean tech tough tech?
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. Most of ocean tech is tough tech. It's really hard to build hardware that survives in the ocean environment. It's salty. It's got extreme pressure. It's got a lot of energy. If you can imagine the energy in the ocean of 1 cubic meter moving through the ocean, that's a ton of water. That's a lot of energy that beats up on whatever you've got out there. And as the Triton submarine that exploded over the Titanic proves, unless you build it really exactly, the ocean pressures will crush whatever you have. So yes, most of ocean tech is tough tech. There are a few examples. For example, if you're taking a tested ocean technology and expanding it to a terrestrial use, where then you often find that the terrestrial uses are less tough than the ocean. Or, for example, if you have a pure software play. But if you don't mind, I'll give an example of how even pure software plays are tough tech in the ocean. The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, where, as you kindly mentioned, I am a special advisor for innovation and entrepreneurship, purchases 19 different manufacturer sensors for ocean pH, ocean salinity, ocean temperature. And even among those 19 different manufacturers, they have different issue dates and therefore different standards. Every single one of those different manufacturers uses different methodologies for recording data, for transmitting data, because there are no global standards for information technology like there are on the terrestrial world. So WHOI has a team that homologates, that's an old 19th century word for making standardized all the different outputs from these 19 manufacturers. That is a full-time job for a big team of people, just so that they can get data comparability for pH, temperature, and salinity all across the Atlantic and the Pacific. And interestingly enough, that's one of the companies we're working very hard to spin out, because this is a common problem that all companies going into the ocean have. You buy a temperature sensor, you buy a pH sensor, they speak different languages. And WHOI's got a team that actually knows how to make that all speak the same language.
I think that's incredible. That it's still a Tower of Babel issue with this. Is it some? We've heard over the years that we as society know more about space and call it the final frontier. And we know more about that than the seas around us. Do you feel that that's true? And is that measured based on like square footage or in terms of just overall kind of potential like sort of species and life and materials and all of that? Like, what is it that makes it so that the seas are less known than space?
Well, it's always been much harder to go into the ocean because of the factors I mentioned, the pressure, the salinity, the amount of energy that's in the ocean, than it is to go into space. Once you are in outer space, as Forrest, your colleague, will know well, it's relatively common environment. Whereas once you're diving deeper into the ocean, the pressure is getting stronger and stronger for every meter you're going down. And humans have the tendency of, if they can't see something, they don't really give it its fair due or its fair regard. The ocean is mapped roughly at the 100-meter per pixel scale. Mars is at the 10-meter pixel scale. The moon, 1-meter pixel scale. So the bottom of the ocean is massively less well known. In addition, we are sending new, and this is one of the cool areas, remotely operated vehicles or autonomous vehicles down deep. And they are finding basically a new species every time they go down. And so we really don't know the biology of the ocean. And this is one of the big risks, of course, because many people have dreams of ocean CDR. Remember, the ocean produces 50% of the oxygen that we breathe, and it is a much bigger carbon sink than the atmosphere is. So they have all sorts of dreams about CO2 capture of the ocean, but we really don't know the biology. So if you're going to package up land-based biomass, whether it be seaweed or palm fronds, and dump it into the ocean, hoping that the ocean will capture it for centuries, you really don't know what it's going to encounter out there because there just has been so little science done. And the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and myself are urging that we do a lot of science experiments before we start taking our land-based stuff and dumping it in the ocean, just like we've taken land-based stuff and dumping it in the air for so many years.
Wow. So it's something that that there's an advocate for try to slow or be more thoughtful about some of those commercial and some governmental work for like carbon sink or work for climate mitigation to try to slow those developments with the condition that we need to really understand what's going on down there before we can know that we're actually going to be solving the problem if we start to build in to view the ocean as an appropriate like big carbon sink or something to get us that we may just be punting a problem or amplifying it in years time.
That is spot on, Jonathan. Yes. Ocean has the potential, but if we let the business run ahead before the science and before the governmental regulations, we risk creating a garbage dump in the ocean that poses a more difficult problem in the future than the one we have today.
Wow. So then we need to explore the sea, particularly the deep sea, right? And that's got technological barriers. It's just the incredible pressures, disorienting, command and control, I imagine, is very challenging. And there may also be scientific barriers, right, to being able to do that exploration. Could you had touched on some earlier? Could you elaborate on some of those specific aspects of the science and tech barriers that are like, I mean, wouldn't it be cool if, or like, hopefully in the next 10 years we can do X, or have a way to meaningfully engage in the deep sea?
Well, one of the very interesting areas and interesting areas for investment and the barriers also is that the basic infrastructure that we have and take for granted on land does not exist in the open ocean. So the electrical grid doesn't exist. And almost every sensor, almost every way of collecting data requires energy. Secondly, we don't have the communication issues, or the communication structures. We don't have the cell towers. We don't have the ability to link into the internet easily. So when you're in the ocean, you have both the air-water barrier interface. So if you are sending a message underwater, it can't get up into the air to be picked up by the satellites unless you have a device that is sitting right there at the barrier, a buoy, let's say, that is picking up the underwater signal and retransmitting it up to the satellite. So all the things we take for granted in building our networks, our Internet of Things on terrestrial soil, don't exist in the ocean. And we have to build them and get that sort of connectivity before we can have ubiquitous sensors throughout the ocean that can tell us what's going on. So some of the very interesting areas to invest in are taking this terrestrial network and rolling it out into the coastal areas. We see that there will be unicorns of the ocean, very successful companies, which we call narwhals, in the nearshore area. So, for example, the Internet of Things stops basically when you get to ports and marinas. Marinas are, in essence, parking garages for boats, but they have less sensors involved in them than your typical parking garage does. A typical parking garage knows when the slip or when the spot is occupied or not. And a typical marina, it's a guy out there with a clipboard jotting down, there's an open spot. They don't measure at the moment the amount of energy that's used, the amount of water that's used. All the utilities that go to your boats generally don't get measured. One of the companies I've invested in, called Falco, coming out of France, is a complete Internet of Things sensor package for marinas. And so they are taking off by taking the IoT from the land into the first watery realm. Another company I've invested in is, in essence, providing electric vehicle charging stations so that you don't have range anxiety for your electric boat, and they're floating them offshore 10 miles, 20 miles. And so you can actually go out in your electric boat far into the ocean and not worry about running out of power. Just simple land-based technologies moving into the near ocean are where I see there's going to be huge growth opportunities. But there are still huge obstacles than, let's say, 100 miles from shore or 1,000 miles from shore. How do you get the electricity out there? How do you get the communications out there? Those basic fundamental issues are real barriers to science and commerce.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. Yeah, so one I really like the terminology that they can start up land a unicorn being like usually like a $1 billion company, and that the maritime equivalent of that kind of startup would be a narwhal. Good choice of words there. uh, so when I think about farther out to sea where there are the deeper depths, where at the surface level, like the sea surface, we could benefit from things like Starlink, where a ship floating out there can gain access to that sort of celestial communications network, as good as if we're in the mountains of Appalachia, for example. But then it starts to, that's one part. That's not going to help your electric boat get any juice, 1,000 miles to sea. But then as we start to go down on the z-axis, that's where the complexities sound like they really start to like proliferate. Can you describe that the entrepreneurial ecosystem and how that may evolve, probably globally, I think, toward that deeper sea exploration? Is there maybe commercial benefit at all to going into the deep sea, or should the entrepreneurs keep thinking on this like near coastal stuff that like you were describing earlier?
Before I answer that question, I will give you a very interesting little anecdote, at least interesting to me. The greatest migration on Earth is the daily migration of the photoplankton, zooplankton, all of the tiny animals that go from down deep up to the surface or close to the surface each day and then come back down again. They are basically avoiding predators. They're going hundreds of meters up and down every day. And there's such density that the sound waves bounce off them rather than go through them. So if you are transmitting a sound wave, the U.S. Navy in the 1950s thought that the seabed was some miraculous way moving up and down, because at different times of day and night, when they bounced their sound signals, they would hit all of these plankton animals, and they would say, how can the seabed be moving up and down? So it creates this interference. And so if you want to transmit from near the surface to 5,000, 10,000 meters deep, you will suddenly end up with a signal that's blocked by the density of these single-celled, double-celled, small, tiny animals that are moving up and down. To answer your question, there is a really wonderful opportunity for the commercial world to get to know the deep sea. But it's going to take a long time, and you're going to have to be patient. On the biology side, for example, they're finding some very deep sea sponges have unique antibacterial properties. So there is a whole area of going down and sampling for medical and pharma opportunities. On the more physical side, there is the opportunity. One of the things that the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution has discovered is a way of sending sound in a very narrow path over long distances. And this is something that you have to do when you're down deep. Otherwise, the sound goes in all directions and propagates everywhere, and it would just be like being in a noisy bar with lots of background interference. So if you want to communicate, you want to send this line of sight, you might say, pinpoint sound wave. And this just may, have a great impact on hearing aids, because one of the problems with hearing aids is all the background chatter coming in. And so one of the interesting possible narwhals for the ocean is this Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution audio signal being applied to a land-based technology. And we wouldn't have discovered this had we not been doing this in the deep ocean.
That's fascinating. It's something that I really enjoy hearing, where we may be able to take inspiration or even sort of directly take sort of technology developed to solve a problem in one realm and then apply it to another. Our episode sponsor is the End Effector, and in that we wrote Space for Earthlings, that looked at, say, how NASA develops technologies for space. And some of those can be really useful for terrestrial application. So being able to see where there's a team of individuals who are able to look across multiple domains and see potential applications for this, say, what like sounds like sort of like a parametric or like directional audio capability. That's really exciting.
I'm going to hop in here. On the topic of bringing together folks from different fields and domains to solve really important problems, I want to add in that our sponsor, the End Effector, is hosting Tough Tech on Tap, a social gathering for the community building hard things. Our first event will be in the Boston area this May. So check out toughtechOnTap.com for more details. It's all free. As we return to our conversation with Adam de Sala Pool, remember this: no one builds alone.
There's like, so the blue technologies are and the maritime work. Of course, it's a global thing, but the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Do you see sort of hotspots or areas where there's sort of percolation among entrepreneurs that are maybe more exciting, or that you're more likely to place a bet into?
Oh, absolutely. The marine world is filled with hot spots, you might say, and New England is certainly one of them. You have the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Woods Hole, Mass, and also in Woods Hole, Mass, you have the Marine Biological Laboratories for more biological research in the ocean. You have the Woodwell Climate Center. You have the NOAA. Governor Maura Healey has really committed to making the New England or the Massachusetts area a hub of climate tech investment akin to the healthcare investment. You have See Ahead, which is a great organization in Boston that does incubation and angel investing. I'm a member of their Blue Angels group. You have Toby Stapleton down in Rhode Island, and you doing the Blue Venture Forum, and you have the Naval War College there, which is a big promoter of really interesting technologies for naval uses. You've got the Propeller Venture Capital Fund, which was set up by Brian Halligan coming out of HubSpot. All this is in the Boston area. So Boston is really a focal point. But I would say that Europe is doing even better. A place like Portugal, they've got 2 venture capital funds focused on the ocean, Faber and Indico. You've got the Blue Invest in Brussels. You've got the Blue Bio Alliance out in Lisbon as well. You've got a whole active ecosystem. The Swen VC fund is actually the biggest in the world, and close second, I guess, running back and forth is the Aquaspark based in Utrecht, the Netherlands. So Europe is number one. Boston is the leader for America. Halifax is the leader with the Ocean Supercluster up in Canada. Singapore is the leader on the Asian side.
Well, it sounds like there's a incredible amount of activity that I think a lot of folks would be almost blind to, not thinking about it. And it sounds like it's like true blue enthusiasts, partly pun intended, who really are able to see where there's such an advantage to pursuing this unknown space of the seas. Now, in the past I had had the opportunity to help found a company that was in the water space, broadly water speaking, and these companies, roughly as a demographic, are generally atypical for like traditional venture capital investment or other forms of say risk capital, because people are just generally unfamiliar, unfortunately, with the maritime space. So how how do the local ecosystems need to come together? Like if there's maybe a regulator is listening to this episode and is looking at how can they better support their location on a coast. How do we help them help startups in securing funding for these types of tough tech ventures and get better at sort of incubating these kinds of innovative projects?
Well, I have two answers for you on that. First of all, if I'm a regulator, what the biggest challenge is for many of these startups is proving that the concept works in the ocean for at least 12 months, if not 24 months. So having a project facility, both a physical place where you can put your device in the ocean and get it proved out, as well as the funding to build the first 3 to 5 units of this and get them in the ocean working. That is the biggest hurdle. But, Jonathan, on the more optimistic side, I would say that most of the companies that are getting funding these days, and there are quite a few, for example, in my See Ahead Blue Angels, we've done more than 30 different investments. And so, there's a lot of interest out there in this. But, and it's a big but, I would say that the companies that are getting the funding have a link to something terrestrial. So they're in aquaculture, i.e., they're feeding human beings. We may be growing fish or having better sensors or better batteries for aquaculture farms, but the fundamental business is feeding humans. Or they are new technologies for shipping, maritime uses. Maybe they're cybersecurity for maritime. Maybe they are better carbon sequestration or better fuels or better management of your vessels. But shipping, it's a huge business. It presents 3% alone. Shipping is 3% of all the CO2 emissions. It's giant, and it's an existing business. Where do we have a real drought of venture capital and it's hard to solve? It's doing the basic fundamental sciences out deep in the deep ocean that aren't linked to any immediate terrestrial market. But if you can link it to shipping or food, you'll get funded.
That's really interesting. You have such a like a 360 perspective of on like really interesting companies and technologies in the space. Could you describe some more of your favorite companies in ocean technologies?
Oh, I have a lot of favorites because I've invested in a lot of them, and all my children, you might say, are my favorites. But I can pick out a couple. Let's take a company called Inversa. Inversa makes leather for various famous fashion designers, but it makes it out of invasive lionfish and invasive carp. So they pay spear fishermen or other fishermen to go out and catch lionfish or the Asian carp in the Midwest, or actually pythons in the Everglades. And they take those skins of animals which have a rightful place in some ecosystem somewhere, but they're out of that ecosystem and they're in the wrong ecosystem. At the moment, take those invasive species and they take the skin and they have a technology, IP, a patented process for converting it into very fashionable leather so that you can get a watch band or a purse or even sneakers made out of an amazing animal. It's in the wrong place.
Wow. I had no idea. It sounds like it's a great way to solve one ecosystem imbalance and put into a different place in a meaningful way and collect good margin on the process.
Exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating business model. Of course, if they can catch every Asian carp and every invasive python and every lionfish, which they will never do, or I hope they do someday, but not in the short term, they will be out of their business. But it is almost inconceivable that happens. Another cool example, coral vita down in the Caribbean. Probably at your house, Jonathan, you have a gardener who comes and takes care of the garden.
I am the gardener, but yes.
Okay. Well, you plant the flowers and you cut the grass and all that sort of thing. Well, imagine you had this for a coral reef. That's what Coral Vita does. So hotels around the world pay them to plant and maintain the coral strips in front of their property. And so they will go out and they will plant a beautiful coral reef strip in front of your hotel chain property in the Caribbean. And they will go out on a weekly basis and make sure that there's no plastics on it and that there's no algae growing on it. And that if there's a coral that's sick, they will replace it. And therefore they maintain a healthy coral reef, just like a gardener does for you on land.
Wow. So then that's something, it sounds like it's a niche, certainly, but it's something where, say, biologists or ecologists who have been able to research, study, publish on this, and then folks would come as like a practitioner or a physician, learn, the way that coral grow and the whole ecosystem around that, and take care of it as a custodian. And then I imagine in the hotels and other folks who would own beachfront properties would be interested, because then one, it probably just looks better instead of having like trash bags and junk stuck on it, but also for diving and for recreational purposes, as well as maybe even for some elements of like sort of climate resistance as for storm buffering, things like that.
Exactly right. And Coral Vita's secret sauce is that they actually run the nurseries that grow the baby corals into the little plants that they go out and plant.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. That sounds cool. So now with where does Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute then have a position in all of this? What, there's commercial opportunities. You described several fascinating ones there, that are up and running. How does Hui view itself, and what are its sort of boundaries of where it should go, and are there collaborating partners, and how do they approach that? I know you can't necessarily speak on behalf of them, but from your work, I'm sure you have a perspective.
Yes. And yes, I'd like to reiterate that I'm just their advisor. I have no executive authority there, and therefore I can't speak on behalf of them. But Hui is a great research institution, and almost all the people there want to do and are doing impactful research for whoever is sponsoring it. And usually that's the National Science Foundation, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the U.S. government's military arms. But many of these ideas also have dual uses in the commercial side. And so many of the people say, well, who are the researchers go, I'd love to get this out as a company. And that's where I'm advising them on how they can spin these out as companies. But 99% of the researchers I've talked to at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution have no interest in leaving Hui, which is a beautiful place to work, and becoming an entrepreneur. So one of the things I spend my time doing, and one of the things I would ask all of the listeners today, is if you know of somebody who wants to be a CEO or a COO of a ocean tech company, call me up, please. Email me, because there are people at Hui who know that their technologies have commercial, impactful, social opportunities, but aren't doing it because they are doing the pure basic research, which is what they are paid to do by the government agencies who fund most of the activity at Hui.
Well, that's great. I'm really glad you sort of offered that, and that's a great docking point for folks who are enjoying the episode and are like so the self-selection and perhaps of like, I need to engage with Adam because you know where, like I don't know, like air traffic control in terms of where to steer them. It's something that I hear sometimes when I'm working with entrepreneurs where it's they may have some, maybe like hydrophones or some sort of a new development, and looking to understand, is Hui maybe a collaborator in that respect, and I would like your perspective on helping the individuals or companies who've developed something that may be of interest or applicable in maritime. Is there a way to go to Hui and say, we invented a thing or a new capability, are you interested in that? Or is that's not what Hui's about? So
Hui's not really about the commercialization side. If you want to collaborate on a grant from the U.S. government, I'm sure we can help with finding a researcher who wants to collaborate on that. But this is a very academic institution. It is not where you bring your device and get it tested, for example. That's one of the things that the state of Massachusetts could do really well, as I mentioned earlier in the show, is build a piloting facility so you can take your device into the ocean and get it tested. Hui doesn't do that. Hui doesn't rent out its facilities for hire. Hui does basic research, does it very well, and is willing, if other people want to use that basic research in a commercial way, we're very willing to license it. We have an Office of Technology Transfer. We have an express licensing process for early stage companies. They can come in and quickly get access to Hui technology, but no, Hui does not generally work on commercialization and collaboration.
I have two more questions, and the first is what I've been asking you a variety of questions. Is there something that we didn't prepare questions on that you think would be really important for our audience to know about this space?
I was one of the very, very first investors in the clean tech space in the early 1990s. When I set up my first venture capital fund in the clean tech space, it was less than $1 billion a year going into clean tech. It eventually turned out to be very successful, which is why I got to retire at age 55. And I started putting money into the ocean tech space, again, before there was $1 billion a year going into ocean tech. There will be major corrections. There is a large, I would say, frothy area of investment going into ocean climate tech at the moment. There are a lot of people who are hunting for any climate solution and are throwing money at it. There will be a shakeout. The market is not going to grow forever and ever. There will be downturns, as I experienced in climate tech. And so this is not for the faint of heart, but it will eventually be as successful as clean tech has been. It does cover 70% of the planet, and therefore all the things that you see on land will eventually be in the ocean, and you will be able to do everything you do on land in the ocean, whether it's living or science or sport. There will be people who perfect the art of going scuba diving down thousands of feet deep. You may be in some sort of housing to protect yourself from pressure, but it will all be possible. And now is a great time to start getting in to it as an investment. But as I said, it's not for the faint of heart. There will be corrections.
I thank you for that well-earned advice. And on that about being resilient, something that we invite each guest to do to help conclude our show is to to state your name and say "stay tough." Is that something you could do for our audience?
Absolutely. I'm Adam de Sala Pool, and I hope you stay tough.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Adam. And for the purposes of the show, that's a wrap. That was really great. I really appreciate your conversation. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you had fun, because I had fun too.
What?